In this module, we'll be talking about poetry and plays for children's literature. I want you to realize that for young children, they are exposed to poetry when they're like toddlers because poetry begins in the form of nursery rhymes for children. So things like Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, Mary had a little lamb. Now, what we do know is that kids are actually not being exposed to nursery rhymes as much as they used to be. This could be for various reasons, like there's just so many more other kinds of early childhood things for kids to listen to and watch that it used to be like nursery rhymes was all that was really available. But now there's other things. Of course, the more negative side of that is that maybe parents just aren't interacting with their kids as much through singing and book reading and such. But we still can rely on those nursery rhymes, especially if we're teaching preschool, to introduce those and just teach that sing-songy poetry kind of flow to kids. It's important that you remember that poetry for any age can rhyme or not rhyme. We really want to make sure that our students realize this, particularly elementary students, because they kind of get stuck in thinking that poems must rhyme. So we want to make sure that we're exposing them to free verse and other types of poetry as well. Poems can also be just cute and catchy, like a jingle, something very simple. Poems don't have to be really long. There definitely can be lots of different types of poetry. And then, of course, poetry can evoke great emotions, can use really in-depth language, a lot of figurative language. So that's kind of the beauty of poetry, is that it can be so simple and fun and playful, and then it can also be so emotional and have so many layers to it. And so when you do a unit study on poetry or you spread poetry throughout your reading curriculum, you are actually getting a chance to expose kids to a wide, vast opportunity to see lots of different genres of poetry. It's not just the same kinds of things over and over. Always remember, I think for me, the easiest way to teach kids about poetry is to focus on those five senses, because when you read a poem, more often than not, you really think about, like, how does this poem make me feel? Does it evoke any sense of smells or feelings or things I can touch, like any kind of emotions? And so teaching poetry seems to be a real concrete way when you do it through the five senses, especially for our youngest learners. Some important poetry vocabulary terminology that I want to make sure you know. The first one is alliteration. Alliteration is when the initial consonant is heard repeatedly within a few lines. So there I have tongue twisters as an example. So when it's Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, or Silly Sally sells seashells by the seashore, that's an example of alliteration. There's a really great book out there called Piggy Pie, and it says in that story something like, she's looking for 8 plump pink piggies for Piggy Pie. And that's a great book to use to teach kids about alliteration. Onomatopoeia, one of my favorite words to say. Onomatopoeia is when the sound word imitates the actual real word sound. So the word buzz is the word, but it's also the same sound that a bee makes, buzz. When you say the word, it is also evoking a sound. Pow, zap. If you're familiar with the old school Batman, that's what it makes me think of when it like put it up on the screen. Wham, zap, pow. That's a way to show that example for students. Personification. This happens a lot in poetry. That is just when we give human qualities to inanimate objects. This happens a lot when we're comparing things, whether that's emotions or feelings, but we compare them to actual objects and we make them almost like have human-like qualities. A simile is probably one of the most familiar terms for you. That's a comparison using the words like or as. So if I said, that star twinkles like a diamond, that is a simile because you're comparing something to something else by using those connecting words. Whereas a metaphor is just an implied comparison. There is no signal word in a metaphor. The example there is, I am a rainbow. So I'm not saying like, I am like a rainbow because I make people happy. I'm not even saying I'm as beautiful as a rainbow. I'm just saying I am a rainbow, and it's really left up to the interpretation of the reader to determine what that implied comparison is. Hyperbole, it's not hyperbole, which is the way that some people pronounce that. The right word is hyperbole, and that is an exaggeration to the point of just, it being ridiculous. I think about you 1,000 times a day. Well, I probably do think about you a lot, but I'm not sure if it's 1,000 times a day. You hear people say, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. I'm not really planning on eating a horse in particular. I'm not going to eat the whole entire horse. I'm just saying, like, I'm super hungry. So you can think of all kinds of things that people use a hyperbole for, but it does often come out in poetry as well. Plays, of course, are another genre. I'm not going to say a lot about plays, except for the fact that in early childhood and even in middle school, we tend to stay away from big production plays when we think about teaching language arts. Instead, we use something called reader's theater. And if you just Google reader's theater scripts, you'll come up with all kinds of examples that you can use in your classroom. Also, once you become familiar with them, it's easy to take your own picture book that you're using and write your own reader's theater script to use. These are used in classrooms because kids can get up and act out what's happening in the story or in the play, but they're allowed to use a script. So we don't really focus in on memorizing lines or some kind of big production. It's just pulling out the script, letting kids read after you assign the parts. And you don't have to use any props or costumes. And if you do, they are just very, very simple. Maybe if there's a king in the story, you have just a crown and that's it. Or maybe it's something they hold in their hand. But you don't have to spend a lot of money or have a lot of space to store costumes. You just don't worry about that. And instead, you just really let the kids experience the idea of acting out the play. For differentiating instruction, letting kids write their own reader's theater scripts based on something, a book or a novel or a poem, is a great activity to let them do. Okay, so that's short and sweet and to the point, but I wanted you to just be thinking about, don't overlook the importance of poetry, even in the early childhood classroom.